By the winter of 1943, German intelligence was certain of one thing: America couldn't possibly keep up. The U-boat campaign was working. Allied cargo ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Food, weapons, tanks, all vanished beneath the Atlantic waves. And deep inside the steel halls of Germany's naval command, Admiral Karl Dönitz, the mastermind of the U-boat fleet, smiled. He believed victory was just a matter of time. After all, it took months, sometimes years, for the Allies to build a single merchant ship. But what Dönitz didn't know, what no one in Germany could believe, was that across the ocean, in the shipyards of America, a revolution was happening. The United States had found a way to build entire ships faster than the Germans could sink them. 2 a day. Every single day. And when German engineers first heard the number, they thought it was a lie. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of World War II. It began the moment Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, and it would decide the fate of the entire conflict. Hitler's strategy was simple: starve Britain, cut off her lifelines. He unleashed his gray wolves, the U-boat submarines, to hunt Allied convoys across the Atlantic. Their goal was to sink every merchant ship carrying food, oil, or weapons to Britain before it could reach port. By early 1942, the results were devastating. That year alone, U-boats sank over 1,600 Allied ships, more than 7 million tons of cargo. Britain was on the edge of collapse. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later admitted, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." And at that moment, German engineers believed they had finally found the key to victory. But they didn't count on what was coming from America. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, its shipbuilding industry was nowhere near ready for the scale of global conflict ahead. Before the war, an average cargo ship took more than a year to construct, built slowly, piece by highly skilled craftsmen. But America didn't have time for craftsmanship anymore. What it needed was mass production. Ships churned out like automobiles, faster than the enemy could destroy them. So the U.S. Maritime Commission turned to a man named Henry J. Kaiser, a construction genius who had never built a ship in his life. But Kaiser had built dams, tunnels, and highways, and he understood something no one else did: that speed was a weapon. The solution came in the form of a simple, ugly, but revolutionary design: the Liberty ship. Based on a British model called the Ocean Class, it wasn't fast, glamorous, or even beautiful. It could barely make 11 knots, just fast enough to outrun a U-boat on the surface. But it was cheap, durable, and easy to build. Each ship carried about 10,000 tons of cargo, enough to feed an army division for a week, and its parts were prefabricated like pieces of a giant metal puzzle. Instead of building ships from the keel up, Kaiser's yards built them in sections, then welded them together. No rivets, no delays, no nonsense. This method, welding, cut construction time from months to mere weeks. And soon, the first Liberty ships began sliding down the slipways. Their names were patriotic, inspiring: SS Patrick Henry, SS Jeremiah O'Brien, SS John W. Brown, each one a floating symbol of America's promise to fight back. But no one, not even the Americans, were prepared for what came next. Henry Kaiser turned his shipyards into something the world had never seen: a cross between a factory and a military base. He built entire cities to house his workers, men and women from every corner of America, farmers, mechanics, students, housewives, all trained to become welders, riveters, and machinists. In Richmond, California, the docks burned bright 24 hours a day. At the peak of production, 90,000 workers labored around the clock, assembling ships in record time. And then came the moment that stunned the world. In November 1942, at the Oregon Shipbuilding Yard, the crew began building a Liberty ship named SS Robert E. Peary. They worked in shifts, non-stop, day and night. From keel to launch, the ship was completed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. It wasn't just a record, it was a message to Hitler, to Dönitz, and to every German engineer who thought America couldn't match them. You can sink our ships, but we'll build more. faster than you can count. When German intelligence first intercepted reports of Liberty ships being launched at such speed, they dismissed it as propaganda. Their analysts refused to believe it. One engineer reportedly remarked they must be building ships out of paper, but when captured U-boat officers described seeing endless convoys of brand-new cargo vessels, ships that seemed to multiply like swarms, the disbelief turned to dread. The Kriegsmarine realized they were fighting a mathematical war they couldn't win. Even if a U-boat sank 10 ships, 20 more would appear within weeks. By 1943, America's shipyards were producing an astonishing 2 Liberty ships every single day. That's more than 700 a year. A fleet larger than most nations' entire navies. Behind the numbers were ordinary Americans. Factory girls with bandanas, welders with sparks in their hair, dock workers who slept beside their stations. They weren't soldiers. They didn't fight on the front lines. But they were the heart of America's arsenal of democracy. Each Liberty ship launched carried not just supplies but hope. A lifeline connecting factories in Detroit to soldiers in Normandy, to sailors in the Pacific, to bombers over Berlin. And as those ships began to fill the Atlantic once more, the balance of the war began to shift. The tide that once belonged to the U-boats was turning. Not because of a single battle, but because of production. Because of the power to build faster, bigger, and longer than anyone thought possible. And soon, the German engineers who once laughed would be left in absolute disbelief. This was no longer a war of tactics or technology. It was a war of industry, of speed, and of will. And America had just proven it could outbuild an empire. But the story of the Liberty ships doesn't end there. Because as production soared, so did the stakes. And soon these ugly ducklings of war would face their greatest test on the high seas. By early 1942, the United States had declared total war. Every factory, every foundry, and every port became part of one massive industrial symphony. While soldiers trained in fields and pilots filled the skies, the real war, the hidden war, was happening on the production lines. And at the center of it all stood one goal: build ships. Build them fast. These ships would carry everything: tanks, food, oil, aircraft, troops. Without them, no invasion of North Africa, no supply to Britain, and no D-Day would ever be possible. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States was still shaking off the Great Depression. Factories were idle, unemployment was high, and most Americans had never even seen the ocean, let alone built a ship. But when war came, everything changed overnight. President Franklin D. Roosevelt promised to turn America into the arsenal of democracy. He didn't just mean weapons. He meant logistics, mobility, and supply. He knew wars aren't won only by soldiers, but by the machines and ships that move them. So, Roosevelt called upon America's greatest industrial minds: Henry Ford, William Knudsen, and most importantly, Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser, a man of unstoppable optimism, told Washington, "You give me the steel, and I'll give you a ship faster than anyone ever dreamed possible." And he did. Across America's coasts, from Maine to California, shipyards began to rise like cities of steel. But nowhere was this transformation more stunning than at Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon, Kaiser's domains. Kaiser didn't just build shipyards. He built entire communities around them. Housing projects, hospitals, schools, everything needed to sustain tens of thousands of workers. Many of these workers had never built anything before. They were farmers, clerks, mechanics, housewives. And for the first time in American history, women were joining the workforce in massive numbers. They became icons: the Rosies, the Riveters, and Wendy the Welders. In coveralls and bandanas, they stood shoulder to shoulder with men, forging steel and reshaping history. One worker later recalled, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We just knew that every ship we finished meant fewer boys would die overseas. It wasn't just work. It was a race against time." Traditional shipbuilding was slow. Each ship was built from the ground up, thousands of parts assembled piece by piece. But Kaiser brought an engineer's mindset to the problem. He turned the docks into a giant assembly line, inspired by Henry Ford's automotive plants. Every Liberty ship was broken down into prefabricated sections: the bow, stern, decks, and engine room, all built simultaneously in separate shops. Then, massive cranes lifted the pieces into place like a jigsaw puzzle, and instead of riveting, which took time and skill, Kaiser's engineers used welding, a technique that allowed faster, stronger joins. This single innovation cut the average build time from 240 days to under 60. By 1943, some shipyards were completing a new Liberty ship every 10 days. But the real breakthrough wasn't just speed, it was scale. At its peak, the United States had 18 Liberty ship shipyards working at once, employing nearly 500,000 people. At first, the Germans didn't take it seriously. Reports of mass shipbuilding were dismissed as Allied exaggeration. But by mid-1942, German U-boat commanders started noticing something strange. Convoys that were once small and vulnerable were now endless chains stretching across the horizon. The British Admiralty began fielding more escorts, more freighters, and all brand new. In Berlin, intelligence analysts grew uneasy. Intercepted communications hinted that American shipyards were launching ships faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink them. Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered his officers to confirm it. When they reported back, the news was chilling. New Allied ships are appearing at twice the rate we can destroy them. Germany's most secret weapon, the U-boat, was slowly being outnumbered. The hunter was becoming the hunted. By late 1942, Liberty ships were flooding the Atlantic routes. Convoy HX-229, Convoy SC-122. These were massive coordinated movements of supplies. Each convoy had dozens of Liberty ships carrying vital cargo, food, fuel, and ammunition for Britain, the Soviet Union, and North Africa. But the U-boats fought back fiercely. The Atlantic became a graveyard. Over 30,000 Allied sailors died in those dark waters. Still, the ships kept coming. For every Liberty ship that went down, 2 more replaced it. Admiral Dönitz wrote in his war diary, "We are facing a wall of steel that grows by the hour." And German engineers were baffled. They couldn't understand how America was doing it, how a single nation could summon so much material, manpower, and organization. The Liberty ships weren't perfect. They were fast to build, but they were crude. Welded seams, sometimes cracked in icy waters, and early designs had structural flaws that caused ships to break in half under stress. But even with those flaws, they did their job, and they did it better than anyone expected. Each ship cost about $2 million, less than half the cost of a destroyer, and carried over 9,000 tons of cargo. They were reliable, simple, and easy to repair. Their crews, often civilians or merchant mariners, called them ugly ducklings. But to the soldiers on the front lines, they were lifelines, bringing the food and ammo that kept them alive. When captured German officers were interrogated after the war, many admitted they couldn't believe the Liberty ship numbers. One naval engineer reportedly said, "We studied your shipyards and thought the figures must be falsified. No one could build a ship in a week. No one." But it was true. By 1943, America had launched more than 2,700 Liberty ships, enough to replace every loss in the Atlantic several times over. The entire German naval strategy, built on the assumption that they could choke off Britain's supplies, was collapsing. As German factories struggled under Allied bombing, American shipyards ran day and night, lit by floodlights, echoing with the clang of metal and the hum of progress. By 1943, the United States wasn't just keeping up with losses. It was building faster than the entire Axis could destroy. This was more than shipbuilding. It was industrial warfare on a scale never seen before. And soon, the Liberty ships would do more than supply the Allies. They would carry the war back to Europe. The invasion of North Africa, the landings in Sicily, and eventually, D-Day itself, would all depend on them. But first, America's shipyards would have to face their greatest challenge, scaling from hundreds of ships to thousands, without slowing down. German engineers thought it was impossible. American shipbuilders proved it wasn't. And what happened next would leave the Axis powers utterly stunned. By 1943, The tide of war was beginning to turn, not on the battlefields, but in the shipyards. The United States was now building ships at a pace that defied logic, and to the Germans, it looked like a mechanical miracle. Every morning, somewhere along the American coastline, another Liberty ship slipped into the sea. Sometimes two, occasionally even three. The Germans had a name for this phenomenon: Das Schiffswunder, the ship miracle. They were wrong by more than 1,000. By the end of that year, U.S. shipyards had launched over 1,500 Liberty ships, averaging 2 ships every single day. At Kaiser's Richmond shipyard, the numbers were jaw-dropping. More than 90,000 workers operated in 3 shifts 24 hours a day. Welders, engineers, and mechanics swarmed the hulls like ants, racing against time. One foreman recalled, "We didn't have time to think about tiredness. When one ship launched, we already had the next one half done." And soon the shipyards weren't just fast, and they were setting world records. The Robert E. Peary, for instance, was constructed in an unbelievable 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. German analysts refused to believe the report. They thought it was Allied propaganda, until they saw reconnaissance photos showing the ship already sailing. Inside German naval headquarters, Admiral Karl Dönitz stared at the figures with disbelief. His U-boats had been sinking Allied ships at a terrifying rate in 1942, nearly 1/200 that year alone. But now, the balance was shifting. For every ship his submarines destroyed, America was building 2 more. The German strategy of tonnage war, sinking more ships than the Allies could replace, was crumbling. A report sent to the German High Command in March 1943 contained a chilling line: "The Atlantic can no longer be contained. The Americans are producing ships faster than our U-boats can sink them." The Kriegsmarine had underestimated America's industrial might, and now the consequences were catastrophic. The Liberty ships didn't just replace lost tonnage, they transformed the way convoys operated. In 1942, Allied convoys were small, cautious, and heavily protected. By 1943, they were massive floating fortresses, 50, 60, sometimes 100 ships strong. Liberty ships became the backbone of these convoys, carrying everything from fuel to fighter planes. And behind them sailed destroyer escorts, corvettes, and new anti-submarine aircraft, all built from the same unstoppable production lines. The result? The hunters became the hunted. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point. For every U-boat that found a target, 10 more were being hunted down by radar, sonar, and depth charges. The Germans called it Die Schwarze Zeit, the black time, the months when their submarine fleet began to vanish beneath the waves. What made this possible wasn't just steel or machinery, it was people. At Kaiser's shipyards, the workforce was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Black and white workers labored side by side, something unheard of in much of 1940s America. Women made up nearly 1/3 of the entire workforce, and many of them worked not for fame or money, but for a purpose. A woman named Rosie McGee, a welder in Oregon, later said, "We knew every spark from our torches was a message to Hitler that he couldn't win." Children sold war bonds. Families sent letters to the workers thanking them for saving their sons' lives. The shipyards became symbols of unity and defiance. By spring 1943, the Allied convoy system had become an unstoppable machine. While German U-boats lurked below, Liberty ships kept moving, carrying vital fuel and ammunition to Britain and the Soviet Union. Then came Convoy ONS-5, one of the largest naval confrontations of the Atlantic campaign. 42 Liberty ships were part of it, and German U-boats threw everything they had at it. For 5 brutal nights, the convoy was under siege. Explosions lit up the sea and dozens of sailors were lost. But when the smoke cleared, the results shocked the Germans. The Allies had lost 13 ships. The Germans had lost 7 submarines. For the first time, U-boat losses exceeded their kills. The era of the wolf pack was over. And it was largely because of one thing: America's ability to replace ships faster than Germany could destroy them. In Berlin, Engineers at the Blohm and Voss shipyard studied photos of Liberty ships, trying to understand how such crude vessels could be built so fast. Their first assumption was that America was using slave labor or cutting corners. But captured documents revealed something far more alarming: efficiency, prefabrication, standardized design, interchangeable parts, concepts the Germans had dismissed as too simplistic. Now they were watching them rewrite naval warfare. One German naval engineer reportedly remarked during interrogation, "We built ships as craftsmen. You built them as machines." That was the difference. It wasn't a compliment. It was a confession of defeat. The flood of Liberty ships began to ripple through every front of the war. In North Africa, General Eisenhower finally had enough supplies to sustain a massive offensive. In the Soviet Union, Liberty ships delivered tanks, trucks, and food through the deadly Arctic convoys to Murmansk. In the Pacific, they brought fuel and munitions to islands thousands of miles from home. And as the Allies planned their invasion of Europe, the Liberty ships became the beating heart of Operation Overlord. They carried troops, vehicles, and supplies across the English Channel, forming the logistical bridge that made D-Day possible. Without them, the landings might never have happened. By late 1943, German morale was faltering. Their soldiers still fought with discipline and ferocity, but deep down they knew something was wrong. They were running out of fuel, food, and reinforcements. Meanwhile, their enemies seemed to have an endless supply of everything. German propaganda tried to downplay it, calling the Liberty ships floating coffins. But even that lie couldn't uncover the truth. America as shipyards had become a weapon more powerful than any bomb. Every new Liberty ship that entered the ocean was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. As 1943 drew to a close, the Allies were not only surviving the war at sea, they were preparing to win it. But what came next would push America's shipyards to their absolute limit. By 1944, America's Liberty ship program had become something beyond belief, a production miracle that even the Germans, masters of engineering precision, couldn't comprehend. Factories once used for building cars and locomotives now birthed steel giants that fed the Allied war effort. Every ship was a floating artery in a vast logistical network, pumping life into the Allied forces fighting across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. And with every Liberty ship launched, the noose around Nazi Germany grew tighter. Across the United States, more than 18 major shipyards operated day and night. From Richmond, California to Portland, Maine, shipyards lit up the night sky like glowing fortresses of flame and steel. Each Liberty ship required over 250,000 separate parts, but thanks to assembly line techniques, these pieces came together like clockwork. In one yard, entire ship sections, bow, stern, and midships, were built in different cities and then welded together in a single day. The result? An army of cargo ships, identical, dependable, and seemingly infinite. One shipyard foreman put it bluntly, "We stopped thinking of ships as boats. We thought of them as bullets, and we fired them at the enemy." Meanwhile, inside Germany, panic was setting in. The Kriegsmarine was stretched thin, and the Luftwaffe no longer dominated the skies over the Atlantic. German engineers at Blohm and Voss, Werke, and Krupp pored over intelligence reports trying to replicate the American pace. They designed new U-boats, faster, deadlier, hoping to regain control of the seas. But even their most advanced designs, like the Type Fundy-Wendt Electroboot, came too late. While one U-boat could take months to construct, the U.S. could build 50 Liberty ships in the same time. The numbers didn't lie. Germany was being drowned by sheer production. Admiral Dönitz, once confident that his wolf packs would starve Britain into submission, confided to his staff, "The Atlantic is lost. The Americans build ships as though they were toys." As American industry roared, innovation followed. Shipyards began introducing Liberty ship variants: tank carriers, hospital ships, repair vessels, and even floating barracks. Engineers also learned from early design flaws. The first generation of Liberty ships built quickly sometimes suffered metal fractures due to cold Atlantic temperatures. When one vessel, the John P. Gaines, broke in half in 1943, the issue alarmed everyone. But instead of halting production, U.S. engineers worked night and day, strengthening the hull designs, improving steel quality, and refining welding techniques. By 1944, Liberty ships were tougher, faster, and more efficient than ever. Each one represented a lesson learned and a warning to Germany. America's mistakes only made it stronger. Yet the war at sea was far from over. German U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, desperate for one last blow against the Allied convoys. In early 1944, they launched Operation Paukenschlag II, a renewed offensive along the American East Coast and mid-Atlantic routes. But this time, things were different. The Liberty ships now sailed under massive convoy protection, escorted by destroyers and aircraft armed with radar and sonar. Depth charges rained down on any submarine that dared to surface. And above all, the convoys never stopped. If one Liberty ship went down, another replaced it within days. In one battle, a convoy lost 3 ships overnight. By the end of the week, their replacements were already crossing the Atlantic. The Germans were stunned. Their long-feared U-boats had become obsolete, not because they'd grown weaker, but because their enemy had become limitless. June 1944. The greatest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day, was about to begin. Behind the scenes, Liberty ships were the invisible heroes of the operation. They carried over 7 million tons of cargo to Britain in the months leading up to the invasion. They delivered tanks, jeeps, artillery, ammunition, even the prefabricated pieces of the famous Mulberry harbors, which would allow supplies to flow directly onto the beaches of Normandy. When the invasion began, Liberty ships followed close behind the first assault waves, delivering reinforcements and fuel under enemy fire. German observers on the cliffs of Normandy couldn't believe their eyes. The sea was filled not with warships, but with merchant vessels moving in perfect coordination. One German officer later remarked, "We expected warships and destroyers, but the Americans sent factories that floated." Every Liberty ship that arrived kept the invasion alive. Without them, D-Day could have stalled in just a few days. After the invasion, captured German engineers began studying Liberty ship blueprints taken from Allied shipping manuals. They were astonished. These ships weren't elegant. They were practical, modular, and brutally efficient. Where German shipbuilders valued precision and craftsmanship, the Americans valued speed and standardization. Instead of rivets, they used welding. Instead of master craftsmen, they used assembly lines. And instead of years of design perfection, they focused on mass replication. To German engineers raised in an era of elite design culture, this was unthinkable. But it worked. One interrogated engineer reportedly said, "The Americans have turned shipbuilding into mathematics. We were still building art." It was the moment when Germany realized technology alone doesn't win wars. Industry does. By late 1944, the effects of America's shipbuilding dominance were being felt everywhere. German forces in France were retreating, their supply lines shattered. The Luftwaffe could barely fuel its planes. Even Hitler himself raged over the radio intercepts reporting Allied logistics. He reportedly shouted, "They build ships like we build bread. This is not possible." But it was. The Allies had mastered the art of endless supply, and the Liberty ship was the symbol of that power. Every hull sliding into the Atlantic was another strike against Nazi Germany's industrial pride. By the end of 1944, the United States had built over 4,000 Liberty ships, enough steel to stretch from London to Moscow. Entire shipyards operated like living organisms, synchronized, relentless, unstoppable. Kaiser AS men and women had achieved what once sounded insane, building 2 fully operational ships every single day. The Liberty ship had become more than a vessel. It was a message and a floating declaration of what American ingenuity could achieve. And as the year turned to 1945, that message was about to reach its final devastating conclusion, one that would leave German engineers speechless. Because soon, the very weapon Germany had laughed off as cheap and crude would play a direct role in crushing the Reich for good. By the start of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final act, and the Liberty ship was everywhere. From the icy North Sea to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, they formed endless convoys stretching beyond the horizon. Each one carried the lifeblood of victory: fuel, food, ammunition, tanks, and men. And as the Allies closed in on Germany, the Liberty ships didn't just supply the war, they defined it. The Germans had prided themselves on precision, but now it was quantity with quality that ruled the battlefield. And no one was more stunned by this realization than the German engineers and admirals who had once mocked America's ugly ducklings. As Allied forces advanced through France and into Germany, every single bullet, ration, and gallon of fuel came from across the Atlantic, carried by Liberty ships. Behind General Patton's Third Army, supply lines were running at full stretch. At one point, Patton's tanks were consuming 350,000 gallons of fuel per day. When his advance nearly stalled due to shortages, emergency convoys of Liberty ships rushed fuel to Cherbourg and Antwerp. Within days, his tanks were rolling again. Patton himself later remarked, "My men can fight without food, but not without gasoline. Thank God for the men who bring it across." Those men weren't just sailors. They were the invisible warriors of the Liberty fleet. Each convoy that reached port meant another Allied breakthrough. Each ship that docked meant another German town liberated. And every ton of cargo carried across the ocean hammered home the same brutal truth: Germany had lost the industrial war. In the Atlantic, Germany's last hope lay with its submarines, the feared U-boats. But by 1945, they were no longer hunters. They were prey. Outnumbered, outgunned, and constantly tracked by sonar, their crews lived in terror. Every time they surfaced, Allied aircraft spotted them. Every time they tried to attack a convoy, they were met by a storm of depth charges. The Battle of the Atlantic, once Germany's greatest weapon, had turned into a graveyard. Between January and May 1945, over 120 U-boats were destroyed, and the Liberty ships, those supposedly slow, clumsy targets, kept coming, unbroken, unstoppable. One captured German U-boat commander confessed, "We thought we could sink enough to make them stop." But they never stopped. They replaced every ship before the wreckage even sank. That was the moment when the Kriegsmarine realized the war at sea was over. As Allied forces swept into German territory, they captured industrial centers, research papers, and blueprints, evidence of just how far behind Germany had fallen in mass production. German engineers were astonished when they finally saw the numbers. In the time it took them to build a single U-boat or destroyer, America could produce an entire convoy of Liberty ships. A report found in Hamburg's Naval Archives summed it up in one line: their strength was not in their design, but in their repetition. The Liberty ship had proven something no weapon ever had: that industrial momentum could win wars faster than firepower. It was this revelation that haunted Germany's engineers long after the war. Back home, millions of American workers celebrated news of victory, but few of them truly understood just how vital their work had been. In Richmond, California, shipyard whistles blew as the last Liberty ships of the war were launched. Men and women who had worked 12-hour shifts for years finally took a breath. They had built not just ships, but hope. Among them was a welder named Harold McPherson, who had worked on over 100 Liberty ships. When interviewed after the war, he said, "We weren't soldiers, but we fought our war with torches and steel." Those words would echo in every shipyard across America. Even in the final months of the war, Liberty ships remained on the front lines. They ferried troops home from Europe, carried food to starving civilians, and delivered supplies to Allied forces preparing to invade Japan. Their decks were battered, their hulls scarred, but they kept sailing. Some ships even survived direct torpedo hits, patched up and sent back to sea within weeks. By the war's end, 2,710 Liberty ships had been built. Over 200 were sunk, but the rest continued to serve, in Korea, Vietnam, and even into the 1970s as cargo and training vessels. The Germans had once called them temporary ships. Ironically, many outlived the Reich itself. After the war, Allied interrogators questioned dozens of German officers and engineers about America's shipbuilding program. The reactions were a mix of awe and disbelief. One engineer from the Krupp shipyard reportedly said, We believed you were wasting resources, building so many so fast. We thought they would fall apart, but you built faster than we could think. Another, a former naval architect, admitted, we tried to build perfect machines. You built perfect systems. That single insight would become one of the most valuable lessons of the 20th century. It wasn't just the Liberty ship, a steel hull or cargo capacity that won the war. It was the system that produced it. The logistics, the workers, the relentless innovation. Germany had underestimated that system, and it cost them everything. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the world celebrated the fall of Nazi Germany. In ports from New York to Liverpool, Liberty ships blew their foghorns in unison. The sound was deafening, a symphony of triumph across the seas. For many sailors and shipbuilders, it was the first time they realized the full scale of their achievement. They hadn't fired the guns or stormed the beaches, but without them, none of it would have been possible. The Liberty ship had become the unsung hero of victory, the quiet engine behind the Allied machine. Today, only a handful of Liberty ships remain afloat, museum pieces, preserved reminders of an industrial miracle. One of them, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, still sails, proudly maintained by volunteers. When she crossed the Atlantic again in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, veterans wept as they watched her glide into Normandy. That old steel ship, once dismissed as disposable, had outlasted empires. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony. The Germans, known for their engineering perfection, were defeated by something beautifully imperfect, a ship built not for glory, but for purpose. It wasn't polished, it wasn't graceful, but it was enough. And that was what won the war. But the story of the Liberty ship didn't end in 1945. What happened next would shock even the engineers who built them. A twist that proved their legacy was far from over. The war was over. The factories were silent. The shipyards, once blazing with the roar of welders and the hum of cranes, now stood empty. But across the world's oceans, thousands of Liberty ships remained at anchor, their gray hulls rusting quietly in victory. For many, their mission was complete. For others, it was only the beginning. After Germany's surrender and Japan's defeat, the United States found itself with a problem: too many ships. The same miracle of production that had built 2 Liberty ships a day now left the U.S. Navy and Merchant Marine with more than they could ever use. So, thousands of them were placed into storage, moored in quiet harbors and rivers, lined up like an endless steel forest. They were called the ghost fleets. Places like the James River in Virginia or Suisun Bay in California became resting grounds for the ships that had fed, fueled, and armed the free world. But these ships weren't done yet. When war broke out again, in Korea, in Vietnam, and beyond, many of them were called back into service, their engines restarted, their decks once again stacked with supplies. A ship built in 42 days to fight Nazi Germany would later carry cargo to fight the spread of communism. A twist of fate few could have predicted. In post-war Germany, engineers and industrial planners studied captured Allied reports in disbelief. The Liberty ship program became a case study in mass production efficiency, something the Germans had never achieved despite their technological brilliance. One German engineer working in Bremen in 1946 reportedly said, "We tried to make ships that would last a century. You made ships that could win a war." It was a humbling realization. German engineering had always been about precision, tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, designs tested to perfection. But the Americans had mastered something even more powerful: standardization and scale. Every Liberty ship was nearly identical. Every part could be swapped. Every weld in the same place, every process repeatable by anyone, even workers who had never built a ship before the war. In the ruins of Germany's once great shipyards, that lesson struck hard. After the war, when German industries were rebuilt under Allied supervision, they adopted many American techniques: modular assembly lines, interchangeable parts, and production engineering principles that came straight out of the Liberty ship playbook. Ironically, the very system that defeated Germany became the foundation of its post-war recovery. While history remembers generals, battles, and presidents, the true miracle of the Liberty ships came from the people behind them, ordinary Americans, men and women, who worked in sweat and smoke far from the front lines. Rosie the riveters, black welders from the South, immigrant shipwrights from the East Coast. Together, they built the steel backbone of victory. One woman, Beatrice B. Goodwin, who worked as a riveter at the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, said decades later, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We just wanted our boys to come home." And they did, thanks to her and thousands like her. Even now, when historians talk about the Liberty ships, they speak not only of engineering, but of humanity. The war showed what happens when a nation unites around a single goal, fueled by belief and determination rather than fear or pride. And here's the twist few people know. After the war, many Liberty ships were sold for civilian use, converted into cargo ships, passenger liners, even floating warehouses. Some were refitted and sent to new nations, Greece, Italy, and the Philippines, where they became the backbone of commercial shipping fleets for decades. One Liberty ship, the SS John W. Brown, was turned into a floating high school for maritime training in Baltimore. Another, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, became a museum ship, and one of the last fully operational Liberty ships in existence. When the Jeremiah O'Brien steamed across the Atlantic in 1994 to mark the 50th anniversary of D-Day, she crossed the same waters she once braved under U-boat threat. Among her passengers were veterans, old sailors who had served aboard her sister ships half a century earlier. As she sailed into Normandy, the French Navy saluted her. And from the crowd, an elderly man whispered, "She looks as strong as the day we built her." It was more than nostalgia. It was proof that the Liberty ship, that temporary vessel of war, had become immortal. The Liberty ship program didn't just win the war, it redefined how wars and economies would be fought forever. The lessons learned in those shipyards shaped the future of American industry, from automobile factories to aerospace. It proved that mass production could move mountains, that speed could rival precision, and that an army of workers could be just as powerful as an army of soldiers. And perhaps most astonishing of all, the Liberty ship cost only $2 million to build in 1943, less than the price of a modern fighter jet's landing gear today. For that modest cost, each ship could carry 9,000 tons of freedom across the sea. The German engineers who once mocked them would later study them. The Soviet Union would copy their design principles, and the world would never again underestimate the power of industrial democracy. Today, as the last Liberty ships sit quietly in their harbors, their decks creaking under the weight of history, they remind us of something greater than war. They remind us of what ordinary people can achieve when united by purpose, of how innovation, courage, and teamwork can overcome even the darkest forces in history. For every ship that sailed, there were hundreds of hands behind it. Hands that welded, hammered, painted, and believed. They didn't build monuments. They built freedom, one rivet at a time. The German engineers couldn't believe America built 2 Liberty ships a day. But the truth is, it wasn't just about ships. It was about a spirit of determination, resilience, and unity that defined an era and still echoes today. So next time you see an old photograph of a gray, blocky ship cutting through the waves, remember, that ugly duckling carried the weight of a world's hope. And that's something no enemy could ever sink. If you've enjoyed this journey through one of World War II's greatest industrial miracles, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to WW2 Tales. Join us as we uncover more hidden stories, forgotten heroes, and incredible moments that shaped the modern world. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the power we still hold today. The Liberty ships, built to last 5 years, still remembered 80 years later.